Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm so delighted to see so many of you here tonight on this slightly sweltering evening, so it's wonderful to welcome you to the library. I'm Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library, and I'm just going to say a very few brief words before I hand over to our chair for tonight, Professor Jean Seaton. So, we're having this event, Orwell and Antisemitism, that actually Jean has been discussing with the library for a number of years. And we finally this year, very glad to say that we've managed to make it work and make sure that the event has happened. And I think there's many new faces here, to me at least, in the audience tonight. So just to say that if you're not familiar with the Wiener Holocaust Library, we're actually the world's oldest continuously existing archive of documents on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And our founder, Dr. Alfred Wiener, was monitoring and campaigning against anti-Semitism in Germany from 1919 onwards. So this subject is very relevant to us and very relevant to our collections. And we have a busy program of events and exhibitions. So if you want to find out more, obviously, look at our website. Just to say that we have no fire alarm planned for tonight, and the only fire exit is through the front door, the door you came through. So should the fire alarm sound, then that's the way we'd need to evacuate. If you need the toilet, then leave this room by the door that you came in, go to the back of the building, and then down in the lift to the basement, and the toilets are right in front of you there. So tonight, we were hoping to have the LRB here to sell some books related to the event and books by our speakers, but unfortunately the person who was meant to do that was sick. So what we're hoping to do is get a discount of some sort from them and email you all with that. So hopefully you'll hear something about that via email. So also, just before I hand over to Jean, just to say that one of our speakers tonight, Dan Stone, also has done a lot of work in the library and is frequently to be found researching and working in the library. So it's another reason why it's a particularly suitable kind of venue tonight. But I'm now going to hand over to Jean. So tonight's chair is going to be Professor Jean Seaton, who is, of course, the head of the Orwell Foundation. So Jean, or director, I should say.
I'm going to start. Thank you very, very much. Oh, yes, don't. Thank you very, very much. And it's wonderful to see you all here tonight. And I think we've got an extraordinary discussion. I wanted to introduce our two speakers. The Orwell Foundation's got a whole programme of events, and this is one of them. And I'm really grateful to the Wiener Library for helping put this together. And actually, I'd really like to thank one of our own foundation staff, Jeremy Weekly, who's sitting in the front, because this has been something that we have been trying to put together for some years. And we have got it at just the right moment. Tonight, we've got two speakers, both. I'm really sad that the bookseller isn't here, but anyway, so is David. We've got two speakers to discuss Orwell and anti-Semitism, one of whom is Dan Stone, whose book I do have in my hand, The Holocaust and Unfinished History, quite extraordinarily. I've been searching for the right word, actually. It's not magisterial, because that's too pompous, but it is the most wonderfully written, really radical reinterpretation of things, which really masters both personal testimony and all of the historiographical evidence in a very crisp is the wrong word too, but you know what I mean if I say crisp. So we're very, very pleased to have him here. And we've also got David Taylor, who's just published a new biography of Orwell, which I can't hold up because I left my copy at home because it was too hot to carry it. And I thought there would be copies here. But David's new biography of Orwell never has a sentence that doesn't think, never doesn't go forward without asking really important questions about Orwell and where he comes from and what he does. And again, combines really personal, new letters, personal testimony, personal reflections with really very broad themes. So I think we've got two extraordinary authors. So I'm very pleased to have you here. we're going to have a discussion which is going to be broadly chronological. It'll go on for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll ask questions. And have we got somebody who can roam with microphones? We have Barbara who could roam with and at the back. So don't worry, you will be able to hear questions. We may have to stand up for that bit. I just wanted to say there is just no doubt that early on in 1984, early on in Down and Out in London and Paris, and in some of the journalism, and for sometimes there are tropes and words which to the modern ear are clearly anti-Semitic in Orwell's work. And we wanted to have a sophisticated discussion of that and unpack the context and what we make of his developments. So I just wanted to put that out, and we are really proud of tonight. So I wanted to start with actually asking Dan, just can you start to give us some context about the 1930s, this kind of writing, this kind of things, and then I'll go to David.
I think David can speak to the immediate literary context. Yes, no problem. Can you see properly if I stand on this? That's the slight problem. I think David will speak to the immediate literary context to Orwell and his trajectory with respect to his thinking about the Jews. I think I would simply say that Orwell's trajectory both mirrors and doesn't mirror what's going on in the interwar period in general. I think he's very conscious of the fact that anti-Semitism exists, particularly, as he says, after 1934. That's to say, after the Third Reich has been established, that marks a kind of clear dividing line for Orwell between things that could be said in Britain beforehand using anti-Semitic tropes, things that we would consider today anti-Semitic, that Orwell did not consider anti-Semitic, and says that after 1934, one can no longer write in this way because it's not acceptable anymore now that we see what's happening in Nazi Germany. But I think we'll talk more about that because that's not very straightforward. What's striking is that with respect to the Jews and the question of anti-Semitism, the topic seems to play so little a part in Orwell's writings, and it's actually quite important in wider society. And when he does write about it, he is picking up in general on what's being said in Britain about anti-Semitism in the press and in popular opinion. And he's, after the persecution of the Jews in the Third Reich picks up steam, he's very keen to think about the consequences of that, not primarily for the Jews themselves of Nazi-occupied Europe, but for the ways in which anti-Semitism can and cannot be discussed in Britain. But one of the things that's been noticed about Orwell is that he does talk about anti-Semitism to some extent, but after the end of the war, and okay, he only lived another 5 years, but he said almost nothing about what we would now call the Holocaust. Not quite nothing, but almost nothing. And one of the reasons, I suppose, is that for Orwell, anti-fascism was taken for granted. And you see in the interwar period, what Orwell is more interested in than anti-fascism, which is a given, is the problem of communism, the internal problems of communism, Spanish Civil War, obviously, and the role played by Moscow in the unfolding of the Spanish Civil War. So within British politics in the 1930s, there's a debate, obviously, about appeasement, about rearmament, about how to respond to the Spanish Civil War. And Orwell positions himself, I suppose, as someone who, to adopt a later term that he uses about Winston Smith, who thinks of himself as the last man in Europe. So Orwell, I think, tries to position himself as the kind of dissident insider, the social democrat who's not afraid to speak truth to power, whether he's talking about the national government or whether he's talking about communism, whether he's talking about the Labour Party. You know, his attacks on the Left Book Club and the kind of, as he would call it, blimpish understanding of left-wing politics, all mark him out as someone who's willing to take an independent line with respect to many of the burning issues of the day. Which means, of course, that when it comes to the question of the Jews, he suddenly, I think, finds himself taking all sorts of what appear to us now slightly strange positions. But also why this topic is so interesting is that he, and we'll come to this soon, is that he finds himself, rather unusually for a British writer, being able to be self-reflective about his own anti-Semitism and try in some ways over the course of his life to come to terms with it.
Great. David.
Thanks, Jean. Yes, I'd agree with all of that. I'd like to start talking about the sort of wider literary and indeed, to some extent, social context of this. I just want to read a couple of sentences from Orwell's 1948 review of Jean-Paul Sartre's Portrait of the Anti-Semite, where he concludes, "The first step towards serious study of anti-Semitism is to stop regarding it as a crime. Meanwhile, the less talk there is about the Jew or the anti-Semite as a species of animal different from ourselves, the better." Now, that was written in 1948. Before just thinking generally about the way in which writers wrote fiction and indeed other forms of writing in the early 1930s, just to prep myself for this, I had a look the other night at J.B. Priestley's novel, Angel Pavement, enormous bestseller of the interwar era, published in 1930, reviewed quite disparagingly by Orwell when it came out. And you could not call Priestley anti-Semitic. He's a very fair-minded and radical progressive writer. And yet every character in it, or every so often in the novel, you will suddenly find Priestley saying, "The Jewish man who kept the corner shop, the Jew who kept the novelty shop at the end of Angel Pavement." All the way through, Priestley is quantifying Jewish people in terms of their, in fact, he's doing Orwell's trick of referring to the Jew. Many of you, those of you who've read Down and Out in Paris and London, Orwell's first book, published in January 1933, cannot have failed to have been struck by some of the references in it. But the one that always gets me is the beginning of the second half, where Orwell has returned from Paris to London. And he says, almost the first thing he says, he goes into a cafe, or maintains that he is, and said, "In the corner, a Jew, muzzle down in the plate, was guiltily wolfing bacon." Now that is, and it was, people complained about this at the time. People wrote to Galance, Orwell's publisher, and said, "How can a firm called Victor Galance be publishing a book like this, with that sort of thing in it?" It's how does Orwell know he's Jewish? Muzzle down in the plate, the animal imagery. Guiltily, how does he know he's guilty? Wolfing bacon. Now, there are 5 separate words, adjectives and nouns in that sentence that make you kind of recoil. And there are other, one can, I suppose, just there are many, there are anti-Jewish harangues put in the mouth of Boris, the fellow waiter that Orwell meets in Paris. And that's reportage, that's a white Russian talking about his experiences of the First World War. One can just about let that pass, but the Jew muzzled down in the plate, guiltily wolfing bacon. You cannot let that pass, I don't think. And I'm surprised it passed then. To give this, virtually every major English novelist of the 1930s does this in some way. Makes little jokes about Jewish people, defines them in terms of their Jewishness first. And I would have to say, just to give this some personal context, this was something my father did. My father was born in 1921, spent 5 years fighting against fascism in the RAF from 1941 to 1946. And as a child, I can remember him watching television and he'd go, "Oh, that's a Jewish actor there. That singer there, she's Jewish." And you think, why is he doing this? And the answer was that was the cultural background that formed him, which is not to compare him with Orwell, simply to give some context to the times. And we're going to get on in a moment, I think, to the way in which Orwell was, to some extent, forced to confront this tendency in his writing and to make amends about it. But Tosco Fievel, one of Orwell's many Jewish friends, the journalist T.R. Fievel once sort of mentioned this context. And Orwell said something about legitimate barbs for the time. And you think, legitimate barbs for the time? Which time? Why is this? And so there's something lurking deep within the culture and also in the literary culture there, which I think Orwell is almost unconsciously a part of in the 1930s before later on some kind of awareness struck. So that's what I'd like to begin with in terms of context for this. And
perhaps actually in your book, you also actually quite usefully, I think in another way, show the way in which Orwell actually does produce types. One of the things he's always trying to do is produce types, which at the end of his life in 1984 becomes somehow something very elevated, actually, and sort of slightly fairy tale and mystic. But at the beginning of his writing life, he's searching for types. He admires writers who have types, and he nicks their types. And so there is a bigger general sort of problem, which is a sort of writerly, he's a young, incredibly unsuccessful writer at the beginning. Does the Jewish thing partly fall into that?
I think it does. I think that's a very good point. I mean, Orwell's early, I was very struck by this, rereading Orwell's early novels for the purposes of writing this book and for various other things, in that at the beginning of his career, he wants people to be like other people.
Yes. If
you see what I mean. He's not so much interested in quiddity, in specificity, in distinguishing one of his characters from another. His novels are full of, he was the kind of man of, they were the kind of people who. Now, from that kind of blanket generalizing about people, it's only a very short step to racial generalizing, I think. He was the kind of person who was like that because he was Jewish. But I think this is, I would hope, I don't think this is deliberate. I think this is just a way in which he set about beginning his literary career, and that that Jewishness was part of it. I don't think he'd even come that way. He's always it's very interesting actually to go back to his memories of his early life. He doesn't write very much about his time in Burma, right, working for the Imperial Police Force between 1922 and 1927. But he does it then. He had a memory. One of his great memories of Burma was being approached by a sort of outcast boy somewhere in the streets of Rangoon when he was with a friend, and they asked him who he was, and the boy said, "I'm a Jew, sir," and then kind of wandered away. And there's a bit too in Burmese days where Florey reminisces about ancient, about frequenting brothels staffed by ancient Jewish whores with faces like crocodiles. They may well have all been Jewish, but why does he have to make a point of it? It's a central thing, I think, about some of his. Hey, Dan, sorry, you've got things to say about this. Oh, right, okay.
Wait, can we just ask one more question about this sort of early 30s context, which is also about more broadly how acceptable in culture, in politics. I mean, it has occurred to me that you could do another thing. There's literary culture, actually there's political culture, which has people who are saying things who have very contradictory views actually later and act in a very contradictory way. So can we say something about that?
Oh, could I just make one tiny quotation, which is Orwell's almost exact contemporary, Anthony Powell, born 2 years after him, was asked specifically about this context late in life. And Powell always maintained that wasn't something that he did, but when asked about those kind of remarks we just mentioned, Powell remarked somewhat stiffly, it was what one said at the time. So,
I mean, of course, to some extent, it was what one said at the time, and but that is not to excuse it, because there were also at the time plenty of people who objected. And so if you think, for example, about the history of anthropology and race science and eugenics, then you see that the discussion of the Jews as a race, which was no different in many ways from the discussion, let's say, the attempt to divide the world up into different racial groups and to assign racial characteristics to Negroes and Mongoloids and so on. The Jews often were a kind of test case for that anthropology, because there was an assumption made by race scientists that the Jews had remained racially pure for centuries, and yet confusingly looked like the host population everywhere they were. And it never occurred to them that there's a kind of obvious reason for that. But the working assumption was that the Jews had remained racially pure because of Jewish law and Jewish teaching and so on. And so what David was just saying about the simple reaching for notions of group characteristics absolutely characterizes people in politics as well. I mean, the context of the British Empire, which we'll come to because it was so important to not just to Orwell, but to his understanding of anti-Semitism, the notion of racial superiority of the English in particular was just a given. And so in that context, talking about different groups of people as if one could summarize an individual by virtue of which group they belong to, was absolutely the norm. And you see that you can look at Hansard from the 1930s, you can read the political press, you can pick up books about, let's say, fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, written by people of all political stripes, and you find exactly this same group thinking. People who object to the Nazi persecution of the Jews and people who are broadly speaking sympathetic to the Third Reich, nevertheless talk about the Jews as if they form a kind of homogeneous whole. So, I mean, there's so much one could say about this, but I think it's absolutely correct to say that there is in this period a way of thinking about the world that divides human populations up into nice, easily separable groups.
And of course, moving forward, because we're trying to do this chronologically, Orwell is guilty, profoundly guilty of blatant instances of this, specifically in his wartime journals. There's a particular instance in his diary when he's on a crowded tube train in, I think, 1941, and describes a Jewess, a real comic paper Jew, you know, fighting her way off the train, landing blows on everybody. And the awful thing about the Jews is they draw attention to themselves by being so conspicuous. He's got to read it. No, sorry, I'm quoting from memory. You read it. You read it, Dan.
You've done very well from memory, but actually, but he says that this is 25th of October, 1940. The other night examined the crowds sheltering, 1940, sheltering in Chancery Lane, Oxford Circus and Baker Street stations. Not all Jews, but I think a higher proportion of Jews than one would normally see in a crowd of this size. What is bad about Jews is that they are not only conspicuous, but go out of their way to make themselves so. A fearful Jewish woman, a regular comic paper cartoon of a Jewess, fought her way off the train at Oxford Circus, landing blows on anyone who stood in her way. It took me back to old days on the Paris metro.
And that is written by a man both of whose publishers were Jewish, who had many a Jewish journalist friend who was in contact with Jewish emigres by this time, was working with Sebastian Haffner on the foundation of Searchlight Books, published by a Jewish publisher. And it doesn't seem to have occurred to the incongruity, never mind all the other things that one can impute to it, but the incongruity doesn't seem to have occurred to him.
So can we just move this? So I think we've established we've got quite good foundations in feeling rather miserable, if you see what I mean. So can we just move this on just to really what in the politics of Orwell starts to shift, because this is all stuff that's going into the politics. What's the next stage?
Well, I think we should start by, I'd be interested to hear Dan about this rather than me droning on. We should consider this in the context of nascent Zionism, to which Orwell was profoundly opposed, and dropped some fairly offensive remarks about that. This is in sort of 1944, early 1945, when he's working on the left-wing weekly magazine Tribune, which is bossed by Orion Bevan. And anyway, Dan, do you want to give us some context about that?
Well, I think, first of all, Orwell understood anti-Semitism largely through his perception of the empire. So the experience of being in India and in Burma was far more important to him than anything else. And he's on record in one of his letters, I can't, maybe you can remember who too, maybe Feivel again, saying how much worse than Nazi Germany the British rule in India was. And you think, okay, some slight problems with that. But I think when it comes to understanding his anti-Zionism, it's curious, because you see on the one hand a kind of blindness in his understanding, but also a kind of prescience that much of what he said in the late 40s has now become in kind of de rigueur in many discussions today about Israel-Palestine. So I think he understood the Zionist movement, first of all, as a variety of nationalism. I mean, he says at one point that, that Zionist Jews are basically inverted nationalists. They're responding to European nationalism in their own terms, and he dislikes all forms of nationalism. He writes about Zionism in the same way that he writes about Scottish nationalism, and he objects to all of them. And secondly,
all fermented by Jewish newspaper proprietors.
Yes, there is that problem underlying it. And he also, I think, regards Jews, and this is, again, you see his British perspective here, he regards Jews as, taking the colonial metaphor, he regards Jews as sahibs and the Palestinians as coolies, and thinks that the Jews who move to Palestine are European settlers in the nationalist vein, and he sees them in exactly the same way as the British in India. And since his primary political motivation, I think, in the post-war period is to do away with the British Empire, particularly in India, he can't tolerate Zionism. And what's interesting, I think, is that at the time, this seems like an extraordinary blind spot, although he does, to be fair, also propose, by contrast, to offer offer places for 100,000 Jews to come to Britain, where all the Jews in the DP camps in post-war Germany are demanding, and the burden of the Harrison Report and others in the post-war period was to allow 100,000 Jews into Palestine. And Orwell picks this up and says, no, they should come to Britain instead. And so there is a kind of anti-Semitic or some kind of distaste for Jews as representatives of European colonialism and nationalism, which completely misunderstands the history of the Jews in Europe. The idea that Jews were white would not have been acceptable to most Europeans before the mid-20th century. But he also, I think, points to certain problems with respect to Jewish settlement in Palestine that have since become much more commonly heard in terms of debates about the two-state solution and demography in Israel and so on. So it's a really kind of remarkable trajectory to trace.
And he's also, it must be said, by this time, we've got this story up to 1944, 1945, and we have. And the really crucial piece of evidence, I think, for discussion is going to come in a moment. But another point I would like to make is that by this time, particularly when he's literary editor of Tribune and is commissioning material and responding to readers' letters and actually sort of, conducting transactions with quite a wide sort of political literary public, Orwell is conscious of this, because there's a letter to the writer Roy Fuller, who had written rather piteously to him, sort of complaining that a short story he'd written had been accused of anti-Semitism. And Orwell writes back and says, that I don't think what you've written is anti-Jewish, but it seems to me, says Orwell in 1944 or 45, that it's impossible to even mention Jewish people now without being accused of it. So that suggests to me that Orwell's consciousness has begun to shift by that point, that these are issues that he's taking seriously, that he's reflecting on, which brings us, perhaps Dan, you'd like to say something about the famous essay, Revenge is Sour, which is in some ways is where it all kicks off.
Well, maybe you can remember the quote better than I can. In Revenge is Sour, this is, I think, the moment where Tosco Fievel really objects, and where the two friends nearly have a bust-up about this. And I think Fievel decides he's going to keep his mouth shut, simply in the interests of maintaining their friendship. But Orwell writes this piece where he describes a Viennese Jew in an American uniform, as I think is what he says, kicking an SS guard who's been captured at the end of the war. And Orwell thinks this is really tasteless. Can you remember the exact words he then says? I think
I've not got it in front of me, but what he says is that this is simply Orwell observing something and then drawing, as ever, drawing his conclusions. And he's saying that the Viennese Jew, who is, is an American soldier, isn't he? Where does the Viennese Jew bit come? He's a US Army captain, is kicking the man as if it was expected of him. Not as if he actually wants to do it, but as if this is the only appropriate response to having this Nazi in front of you, is to kick him and not really enjoy it, because what pleasure is there, what point are you proving? And Fievel's response to this is, here is something that symbolizes, one of the greatest crimes in world history, and you give it a paragraph, George, and you call the man a Viennese Jew. And anyway,
in an American uniform, it's even worse. But what's so interesting is that he makes this slip, but at the same time, around about the same time, he's also writing about how the way to investigate anti-Semitism is not to start thinking about what other people write, but to investigate it in one's own mind, and to try and grapple with the problem from the point of view of oneself. And he conspicuously fails to do that when talking to Fievel. And he does also make the point that in one of his very few references explicitly to what we'd call the Holocaust, he talks about the fact that millions of people in this country have forgotten about Dachau and Buchenwald because they just don't really care enough. They haven't bothered to register what's happened in the Nazi camps because they don't really care enough. And so you see, on the one hand, he knows about it, and he thinks he's thinking about it, but still makes these sort of, as he would say, pre-1934 anti-Semitic slips.
Well, I'm not here to defend Orwell on this particular one, but again, just to supply some context, I had to write something recently about Orwell, Hitler and Stalin in the context of the 1940s. And Orwell's political consciousness, although obviously he was always aware of Germany, and he was aware of, you know, British people were in favor of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But as far as I'm concerned, Orwell's political consciousness was pretty much forged in revolutionary Spain, in Barcelona in 1937. And although, on the one hand, the enemy was fascism, and Orwell was shot, as many of you doubtless know, was shot through the throat by a fascist sniper and only narrowly survived. Orwell's it was the internal enemy that really concerned him in Spain. It was Spanish government hit squads at Soviet direction who, you know, were putting his name on death lists, and he barely escaped from, you know, had he remained in Spain another 2 or 3 days, he probably wouldn't have gone out in the summer of 1937. So his focus is always on the Soviet East. And in fact, there's an extremely, this is only sort of, you know, in parenthesis, but there's an incredibly odd in view of what came, there's an incredibly odd review of Mein Kampf that he does early in 1940, where he says that he'd like to put it on record that he's never really been able to, you know, to dislike or to hate Hitler, and that his face has a face of one who labors under intolerable sufferings, like pictures of the, you know, like pictures of Christ. And you think, this is extraordinary, you know, even even pre-Dunkirk and pre the Blitzkrieg writing there. Sorry, you've got it. Yeah, read it. Read some of it to us.
I will read. This is from March 1940. It is quite extraordinary. Let me just find. Hitler could not have succeeded against his many rivals if it had not been for the attraction of his own personality, which one can feel even in the clumsy writing of Mein Kampf, and which is no doubt overwhelming when one hears his speeches. I should like to put it on record that I have never been able to dislike Hitler. Ever since he came to power, till then, like nearly everyone, I had been deceived into thinking that he did not matter. I have reflected that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach of him, but that I could feel no personal animosity. The fact is that there is something deeply appealing about him, etc., etc. But I think what's also so striking about this review, and we'll come to this in a moment, is that he then turns to try and explain the appeal of Nazism. And this, I think, is where Orwell gets really interesting when he's thinking about his own grappling with anti-Semitism. Because at the end of this review, he says, Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples, whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way have said to people, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle, danger, and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they will get sick of it and change their minds, as at the end of the last war. After a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number is a good slogan. But at this moment, better an end with horror than a horror without end is a winner. Now that we are fighting against the man who coined it, we ought not to underrate its emotional appeal.
And this, of course, is, we're talking about this in the context of dystopia, in terrible projections of an imagined future. This is Orwell's argument against Huxley in Brave New World, in that ultimately, when it comes down to it, people don't want hedonism. They don't want a soft life. They actually sometimes incline to a bit of danger and you know, want to be precipice curled.
Wait, can we just go back to the sort of political, the politics which begins to forge? By this time, there's lots of politics which has already forged him. He's been an imperial policeman. He's actually done down and out, whatever you think about it. That's a kind of forging experience. He's He's done the road to Wigan Pier. He's been enormously ill. I mean, one of the things that David's book actually really does ram home is just how extraordinary he is, because he is very ill for a very long time and completely ignores it. You know, he just kind of ignores it. So how do those, and he always tries to see himself as somebody that's on the side of something called socialism, and he starts off as a pacifist. And what are the key points in the forging of a political Orwell that make him begin to reflect and indeed produce in the end 1984, which we'll come on to at the end? What are the key transformations?
I think it's certainly, and I'd be interested in Dan's view about this, but in however limited a way, post that Revenge is Sour article. So this is 1945. He's been in occupied Europe as a war correspondent, not really as a war correspondent. He's actually someone who's sort of following along in the wake.
His wife dies.
His wife dies, yes, on the operating table while he's away. And he's beginning to, his theories of the post-war, his projections of the post-war world are beginning to take shape in his mind. I mean, he gets the idea from 1984 from the Tehran conference in 1943, when effectively Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill sat down, deliberated and carved up the post-war world. And so the idea of the three endlessly contesting land masses and all the kind of backdrop to 1984 is beginning to take shape. But I'm conscious, looking at specifically at the things he writes about Jewishness and Jews, and in some, and we'll get onto this in a bit, the things he cancels in his writings about Jewishness and Jews, that there is some psychological motor going towards reparation without anything being explicitly stated. He's trying to make up for past misdemeanors in this field, don't you think, Dan?
I do think so, and I think that's most clear, I think, in 1984, where obviously the figure of Goldstein is based on Trotsky, and the idea of the 2-minute hate and the campaigning against Goldstein is quite obvious demonstration of the ways in which anti-Semitism can be mobilized by a totalitarian regime. And 1984 obviously has been, and still is, used and read by all school children in this country as a novel about the dangers of totalitarianism, which it is. But there's also, I think, an aspect of representation of Jews in it that has been largely overlooked. And one particular moment of that occurs right at the very start. And so Winston, when he sits down to write his diary, describes going to the cinema and talks about the proles cheering as the film shows the bombing of a refugee ship. And this is very contemporary feeling that this refugee ship is bombed, and he says a Jewish woman on the boat puts her arm out to protect her son from being shot, as if it would make any difference. And again, he does exactly what you said before. He identifies this woman as a Jew without any evidence being provided. But the fact that she's a Jew and the fact that she's a Jewish refugee tells you something about the nature of statelessness. Here is where Orwell intersects with Hannah Arendt, I think, to some extent. This notion of statelessness, which is hard to understand in the context of the three world powers that Orwell describes in 1984. But nevertheless, this figure of the refugee is often overlooked because the book is read as being about totalitarianism, but it's there throughout, actually. It occurs on various moments when Winston is writing in his diaries and reflecting on what he's seen.
And what the other thing too is that in exactly those passages you're describing, I had to read the manuscript. I say the manuscript, there's only 40% of it left of 1984 recently, to write an introduction to a new facsimile edition. And there's a very interesting cancelled passage, which exists alongside the bit that Dan's just read, where Orwell, one of the people getting strafed in the water, is originally in the text is an old fat Jewish man. And he takes out the Jewish reference because the whole thing is derogatory. So why should the Jewishness be part of the derogatory description? So that goes. I mean, it's a tiny thing, but it shows the way his mind was working, I think, towards the end of his life. But there's also, I mean, he there's that long piece he writes to the Contemporary Jewish Record as well, isn't he? Which perhaps you'd like to.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that because I think this is where we see, I think in 1984 you can see Orwell in a sense making amends for his previous infelicities, but I think in his journalism you can see him consciously working out how to try and understand anti-Semitism. And what's so striking for me is because I've done some research previously on some of the emigre political thinkers who came to Britain and wrote about fascism, and how much more insightful they were in understanding Nazism and fascism in general than the mainstream British commentators, the Times leaders and so on. And Orwell, despite positioning himself, like in the attack on Sartre, who he describes as hot air, Orwell positions himself as being a kind of down-to-earth British empiricist, but actually, when it comes to when it comes to understanding anti-Semitism, as in the review of Mein Kampf, he ends up by talking about it as an emotional, affective process and problem that has to be grappled with. And I just want to give a couple of examples and then come to how he tries to deal with it himself. So this is a fabulous piece, a review of H.G. Wells called Wells, Hitler and the World State. And in it, he describes Hitler as a criminal lunatic. He says, modern Germany is far more scientific than England and far more barbarous. In other words, there's a kind of dialectic of enlightenment aspect to what Orwell is writing. I mean, I don't think anyone's written about Orwell and Adorno, but in exactly that kind of favorable way, but it makes a little bit of sense. But then he ends this review of Wells by saying, creatures out of the dark ages have come marching into the present. And if they are ghosts, they are at any rate ghosts which need a strong magic to lay them. The people who have shown the best understanding of fascism are either those who have suffered under it or those who have a fascist streak in themselves. Kipling would have understood the appeal of Hitler. Wells is too sane to understand the modern world. Which is, I think,
as well. I mean, I would want to add that Orwell remarked of Jack London, who had wrote a fascist dystopian himself, that he understood fascism because he had a fascist streak in himself. I think the same can be said of our man. Yeah.
Right. And then he in this article that he published in the Contemporary Jewish Record, which was an American publication in 1945, I think this is where you can see him really grappling with the psychological problem. And this interests me because, again, Orwell, so far as we know, and it's mentioned, I think, by maybe Feivel and a few others, refer to the fact that he regarded psychoanalysis also as kind of mumbo jumbo, but he uses then words and a vocabulary that suggests otherwise. And so he says, one of the marks of anti-Semitism is an ability to believe stories that could not possibly be true. People don't want to talk about anti-Semitism, not only because of the fear of discovering that anti-Semitism is spreading, but of discovering that they themselves are infected by it. Infected is the word that he used. He says, I believe anti-Semitism to be essentially a neurosis, but of course it has its rationalizations. And then he goes on to say, anti-Semitism is at bottom quite irrational and will not yield to argument. And ends the piece by saying, it will be seen, therefore, that the starting point for any investigation of anti-Semitism should not be, why does this obviously irrational belief appeal to other people, but why does anti-Semitism appeal to me? What is there about it that I feel to be true? And that, I think, is really a kind of pleasingly un-English and really quite startling instruction from Orwell, that actually everybody has a bit of this going on in them, and they're not just anti-Semitism, but he's pointing to the fact, I think this is a psychoanalytic insight, that a human propensity for hatred and for evil is part of human nature. And Orwell is trying to say, you can't get rid of anti-Semitism by offering statistics about how many Jews have won Nobel Prizes and such things. You have to try and understand and combat it as an irrational force.
And in the context of what other British novelists were writing at that time, that's fairly exceptional, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Perhaps we'll sort of stop there and take some questions. But thank you very much. And I suppose the only other thing I'd have put in was that Orwell does understand fear. He's got a strand of violence in him, but he also understands, probably from Spain, but from other things. He never says it, but he really understands fear. I think he's one of the best describers of the effects of fear, and you feel it in him the whole time. So there is some, he doesn't talk about it, but there is lots of things he does talk about. So I think there's something that is a bridge, actually, a bridge. And he always uses his own, he uses his own nastiness in a way that's completely unique. I mean, you know, he just loves how horrible he is. So, I mean, perhaps, I'm sorry, we keep bumping up and down like sort of, but if people have got any questions, we got a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. Fascinating discussion. I just wonder what that discussion means for Orwell's status in the anti-fascist movement as an anti-fascist. He's obviously very valorized within anti-fascist circles as this figure before Spain, fascist. Does this anti-Semitism challenge that status, or should it demand a re-evaluation of it, or does it just be more about anti-fascism's ability to paradoxically detach opposition to fascism from anti-Semitism and racism?
I suppose my answer to that, and it's a very interesting question, bringing those two aspects together. I suppose I would say that when Orwell was actually fighting against fascism in 1937, when fighting against fascism was itself questionable on the left in terms of, you know, in terms of what was going on in revolutionary Spain, anti-Semitism wouldn't have come into it very much, because there you were. I mean, the kind of fascism that Franco was attempting to institute in Spain was pretty much feudal, really. It was very different, and Orwell makes this, was very different to what was going on in Mussolini's Italy and in Hitler's Germany. And also makes the point, again, an extraordinarily objective point to make from a man who was shot through the throat by a fascist sniper. He said that pretty much he thought in Spain that the side you fought on in the Spanish War was pretty much due to where you lived. So it was much more of a regional thing in Spain. The issues were so clouded and so sort of muddied up in all kinds of ways that I'm not sure that invalidates, you know, his experience of being there in 1937. Subsequently, different thing, but that's where, you know, that's where his to me anyway, the vast majority of his political sensibility was forged. Fighting Franco, and at the same time watching your back from your own left-wing supposed comrades. It's a very, very it's a very tricky position in which to forge your, you know, your anti-fascist credentials.
Thank you. There's a kind of cunning question, and I agree with David about the importance of Spain. I think Orwell was, not sure if he's right, but for the wrong reasons or wrong for the right reasons about probably the latter, where, you know, because he talks about Moscow-directed communism as ruining the left's chances, you know, because of all the infighting against Francoism and against the nationalists. Whereas I think he was right to attack the communists for attacking the POUM and other leftists, the anarchists and so on. But actually the presence of the Soviet-backed communists prolonged the war, and it would have been over much sooner, I think, if they hadn't turned up, irrespective of the infighting. And so I think that training that he had in both fighting fascism and fighting communism was absolutely crucial to forming his political outlook. And in that sense, I don't think we can doubt his anti-fascism. I think that's absolutely clear. But we know there are other examples of writers and thinkers who could be both anti-fascist on the one hand and anti-Semitic on the other. It's in the same way that one could be anti-Semitic in France and yet not necessarily a supporter of the Vichy regime. There are these kind of curious people who don't fit neatly into the categories. So I would say, with specific reference to Orwell, that what we've talked about simply makes him seem like a normal human being and not a we're not producing a hagiography of Orwell, which does sometimes happen on the anti-fascist left. And we're trying to say this is a man with not just with ordinary human foibles, but what's interesting about him is that he knew it and tried to understand what was going on in his own head. And that, I think, is what continues to make him somebody worthy of our attention.
Yeah.
That will appear in 10 days' time, called George Orwell and Antisemitism. And the reason they accepted it is that I spent much of the 1970s writing for them when Tosco Fievel was my literary editor.
Right.
And in the mid-70s, when we would have lunch at Crank's, because he was the first vegetarian I met, and I knew that he was a friend of Orwell, I would badger him to write about that friendship and to write about George Orwell. And he would smile and say, one day, one day. And eventually he did, and his book is very good. Now, the piece I've written, hopefully, isn't disturbed too much by what you blokes have said today. I don't think it's undermined terribly. But I think Fievel was, to some extent, and Koestler to a slightly lesser extent, and I met Koestler as well, was his Jewish conscience. And he pricked at Orwell and made him consider and maybe reconsider. But at the same time, that description of Goldstein at the end in 1984 is still pretty ugly. It's still pretty nasty. I've got it here and I can read it if you want, but it's horrible. And it's anti-Semitic in many ways. And you end up thinking, I think, that, well, I end my piece by saying, look, that bronze statue outside the BBC is very nice, but if you look carefully, it might have feet of clay.
I agree with you about Tosco Fievel's memoir. I think it's one of the best things about Orwell ever written in terms of the personal, having observed him. Do I need to stand up for this? Can you? Okay. In terms of having observed him very closely over a period of several years, and also having been there at the time when they were forging Searchlight books in the early 1940s, the accounts of Orwell at Scarlett's Farm at Orwell, they're very, very interesting. They're very, very good about his personal manner, about his distractedness. I mean, it was Fievel, wasn't it, who was there when Orwell pulled all these tax demands out of his pocket and said, revenue keeps sending these things. I have no idea why or what I'm supposed to do with them. And so he's very good on all kinds of aspects of it. No, I absolutely, so I agree with you. It's obviously we've only got Fievel's side of the relationship, but it's as if he's kind of, while admiring him greatly, and there are things that he doesn't dare say or doesn't want to say to Orwell, but as you say, he's pushing away all the time. He's just making little comments and seeing how Orwell will come back. And I think one of Orwell's characteristics actually as a friend or as a confidant was that he would sometimes not actually respond. Something was said to him, he would simply not, and then take it away and chew over it. And you would then find some piece of writing that reflected on it. Or, I mean, a lot of the 1984 itself, I think, was created in those conditions, because several of his friends have said that they'd be chatting away over tea, and then a bit later they'd find something Orwell had written that kind of referred to it or went off on a tangent from it. And I think in a lot of ways, Fievel embodies that.
That's fascinating what you say, and all I would add, I suppose, I don't feel I'm here to defend Orwell, but to historicize him. And I think the passage from 1984 that you referred to, yes, it can be read as anti-Semitic, but I think given what we've tried to discuss here, I would say that what's happening in 1984 is that he's showing how anti-Semitism can be, to use a horrible term today, operationalized or weaponized in the service of a totalitarian regime. And so taken on its own, the description is anti-Semitic, but taken in the context of the book, it's about the workings of the regime and how hate is used in order to direct the masses. That would be my only kind of nuance to what you said.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Question really directed at David Taylor. Bernard Crick's biography of Orwell, I think, came out about 1980. And there are very few references in that to Jews or Orwell and anti-Semitism, and certainly no analysis of Orwell's anti-Semitism. And I just wondered whether that says more about, you know, the time and the fact that he was writing from a sort of left politics point of view and wasn't interested in that, or there are other reasons why it wasn't mentioned and we've now moved on. I'd be interested to know what you feel about that.
Well, I must say that I ought to pay tribute to Bernard Crick's book, which was an absolutely pioneering work, and why Sonia, Orwell's widow, who lived to see it published and lived to say that she had traduced her husband's memory by allowing it to be published, why she said that I do not know, because it's a pioneering work based on archival research that nobody else had done previously. And interviewing. But Bernard, I think it is fair to say, had a particular, I mean, obviously he was a politics professor, and so he comes, and I got the impression, there is a passage in that book where he says that, you know, to a certain kind of, and how old was he? His early 50s when he wrote the book, he says to a certain kind of old war era lefty, I think amongst whom he himself would probably include himself. You know, to him, Orwell is the Orwell of Tribune, and the Orwell of As I Please, and the Orwell of, you know, the Orwell who was shaping up trying. And I, you know, I will candidly admit I come from Orwell from a slightly different angle. I'm just a literary bloke, and you know, while being fascinated by the politics, I see Orwell as a literary bloke. You know, having to write for a living. You know, I mean, obviously he's living to write, but he's writing to live at the same time, and so. I tend to see him, you know, as a writer in the round, I suppose, and something like, and obviously I don't know, 35 years younger than Bernard Crick, and I think I see it in that, you know, in the terms of a consciousness that was forged in a slightly later period. So I would tend to agree with you that it's kind of, you know, just as Anthony Pohl, when certain slightly dodgy passages were pointed out to him in his early novels, just as he said it was what one wrote at the time, I think it possibly may not have occurred to Bernard Crick at that point that this was worth investigating. I mean, Jean, you knew him very well. Do you have anything to say about that?
I was around when he was buzzing around like a bee in a water butt, doing it. And I remember reading it while very pregnant, very, very clearly. I was just going to say something. I think, you know, biographies are also books of their times, and that's what, you know, how you take on a person is how you take on the problems you see. And I think that when Bernard was writing it, he came out of a particular amazing political formation, actually. But I don't think that anti-Semitism, it looked like it was a problem from the past, actually. I'm not saying it was.
Bernard he was writing too at the height of the Cold War, wasn't he? I mean, he was writing that book in the late 1970s when it was, you know, the international situation was highly dichotomized. You know, perhaps in a way that it is now, but that probably would have been at the forefront of his mind when he wrote it, I would have thought.
Well, he was buzzing around Bernard big, but I mean, so I think biography, and David's first biography of Orwell has this wonderful chapter in it, which is Orwell and the Jews, which is what.
So there's a yeah, it's in the new one too.
So it's the new one, but the first one, there was a curious way in which I think you came to it first through the puzzle of the personal relationships.
Possibly, yeah, possibly.
So I mean, all I can add is that I think that biographies actually endure, but they also reflect the times in which they're and the preoccupations. They're never perfect, you know.
So I was very interested in what you were saying about the sort of early, you know, what was acceptable at the time. And I was thinking about some of the things my dad used to say, which now, you know, referring to people of color was one of his, you know, favorites. And I was thinking about Orwell's education and what he may have picked up from his time at Eton and the group that he hung out with there. And, you know, his cohort that he, you know, grew up with and what views he may have, you know, picked up from them.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I've already talked about my father's, remarks used to make. And my father's word, I've never heard it previously. My father's word for a Jewish person was a shonk. Anyone ever heard that one? Yeah, but see, one person in a room, and my father would look. My father would look at songs of praise or something and look at the choir. Oh, look, there's a shonk. And I do not believe he was anti-Semitic. He just liked making little jokes about Jewish people as, someone born into a working class family in a provincial city in 1921. And I think that, Orwell's upbringing, I think he, until he started thinking about it, which I imagine that he did in Burma, I think his upbringing was entirely conventional. And he would have shared most of the, unconsciously possibly, most of the prejudices of the time. And it was only later that he began to kind of, and even sort of coming back to, when he came back to live with his parents in Southwold on the Suffolk coast in the late 1920s, and he despised or affected to despise the locale, but he fitted in there, and people knew that he was the son of a gentleman. However much they might, disparage him for walking around 3 days away from a shave or whatever, he was a gentleman's son, and I think he's. Although his rebellious tendencies can be perceived quite early on, I think sloughing off that skin is very, very difficult, even if you're the young Eric Blair in 1929 or wherever.
Yes, question there. Is that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Just want to add to that, because my father was exactly the same, except he's 20 years older than your dad. RAF during the war, the same stuff. Mm. But to the gentleman who raised the question of the upbringing in Eton, this may be slightly unfair because you weren't prepared for this, but could I ask, if you were discussing Orwell's attitude towards people of colour, how different is this? Simply not a matter of somebody of a certain era of a certain upbringing who is white and who just has a bit of a problem with everybody who isn't quite like them?
I would make a distinction there. I've never seen any, in all of Orwell's writing ever, right from the start, I've never seen anything that could be described as racial prejudice against black people. He makes a thing of it, especially when he's working for the BBC, 1941 to 43. He's thrown into the company of a great many Indian and, as he would call them, Negro broadcasters, and his attitude then was completely scrupulous, and they tended to admire him. Una Marston, for example, the West Indian poet, was a real friend and wrote to him after she'd gone back to Jamaica, asking him how he was and so forth. And he quite often sort of preaches in his quite early writings, preaches little lessons about it. And there's that very prescient essay, I can't pronounce the proper title because you'd all be scandalized, but it's called Not Counting Inwards, where he actually takes apart British left-wing politics in the context of 1939, because he says it involves, everything we do involves admitting that our economy is based on empire and subjugation of inferior native races. And until we confront that, we're never going to get social equality in this country or anywhere else. So I would make a distinction there. I've always been very conscious of his. It does.
Any more questions? One question. Okay, shall we take a little line of questions? Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm French, so I haven't that big knowledge of Orwell, but of course in 1984. But I just remember a few years ago in the Cannes Festival, a movie director that I really admire, still admire, but Lars von Trier, made a very, very strong and shocking comment about Hitler. And that was his Godwin point moment, but he just went for it and said, I understand Hitler. And everyone in the room were shocked, and he was nearly banned from the festival, though his Lars von Trier's father was Jewish as well, he found out later in his life. But it made me think of that quote that I had never heard about, the one you said so Orwell is reflecting on his appeal towards Hitler. So I just wanted to know, when was it written? At a point where Mein Kampf was probably ignored by many other people, and is it a way?
It's March 1940, I think. Oh, so
okay,
it was only 6 months into the war.
Right. No,
pre Dunkirk, pre the Blitz, pre the Soviets.
So,
I mean,
but is there a way to describe the phenomenon Hitler and rising power as a, you know, the banality of evil, that we can be attracted by someone we can. So was he fighting against himself and saying, listen, we can be attracted by evil, and even today, like, I don't know.
That's quite a deep analysis, if you like. I think, first of all, I'll just refer to the review. It is, as David says, March 1940, and that's because at that point, a new so-called unexpurgated version of the English translation of Mein Kampf had been published. And the publication history of Mein Kampf in this country, as in France and in the US and elsewhere, is very interesting. And there had been an edition published in 1933, but it was very much knocked about to make it favorable to Hitler, insofar as one can do that with Mein Kampf. And then this Hurst and Blackett, the publishers, produced a new unexpurgated version. And then when the war began, they suddenly announced that they were going to donate all the proceeds to the Red Cross. And one of someone else that I've written about, a woman called Emily Lorimer, who published a book about the Third Reich in the Penguin Special series, said, on hearing about this, she said, this is like saying that Judas will give his money to some homeless Pharisees. And so you have this, people mocking this whole process, but Orwell does something slightly different, which is, as we see, to take Hitler seriously, and that's very un-English in a way, I think, because all the political commentators.
He was a comic figure, wasn't he? Essentially,
he was either mocked as being a kind of a buffoonish type figure, or people would say, okay, here's somebody who's crazy, but once he has to behave as the head of a sovereign state, he'll get drawn into the regular comity of nations and the diplomatic niceties and so on, and he'll calm down. And Orwell says this is not going to happen. And here, I think, the importance is his relationships with the emigres, particularly Sebastian Haffner and Franz Borkenau, who he also writes about, and both of whom say in their books that the only way to understand Hitler is as a madman who has to be eliminated. Haffner explicitly says the only way to deal with Hitler is to eliminate him. And he also says that it's totally unhelpful to tabulate Hitler in terms of the history of ideas of modern Europe. He says what we have to do instead is the inverse, and to regard modern European history as part of Hitler's private life. And that's how we understand Hitler, and why he has to be just like done away with before we can make any progress with him.
And all this is interestingly, all this is prefigured the previous year in Coming Up for Air, his novel of 1939, in a conversation between the hero George Bowling and a retired classics master called Porteous, who dismisses Hitler as ephemeral, my dear boy. It's just simply ephemeral. And George Bowling says, no, that's the thing. They're not, are they? And you've got to do something about them. And you can't just compare him to all the tyrants of the past, because, they hung, drew and quarter people just for fun. Hitler's not like that. It's all much more serious. So I think that, yeah.
What's curious then is that you have this, what I think is a way of understanding Nazism and the Third Reich, which has long-term ramifications after the World War, sitting side by side with Orwell's own history of anti-Semitism and his failure to talk about the Holocaust. And scholars who've written about this say, well, how could he have written about the Holocaust? Not only did the term not exist, there hadn't been any historical research, nobody was really talking about it. And I think for somebody of Orwell's stature, none of that is really quite good enough an excuse for thinking about why he didn't discuss it. I mean, he was aware of what had happened in Nazi-occupied Europe to the Jews. There are a few passing references here and there in some of the work he did in the BBC and some of his other writings, but he doesn't really, it just doesn't concern him in the same way that the empire does, particularly India. But what's important is that his ideas are then taken up by others after the war. And if I have time, one of the most important, I think, is his friend David Astor, who became the editor of The Observer for many years after World War II. And Astor, in the early 60s, first of all, he published a leader in The Observer called The Meaning of Eichmann at the time of the Eichmann trial. And the meaning of suggests already a kind of psychoanalytically inflected way of thinking. And he then came up, Astor himself, who was from an extremely wealthy family, the Astors, and who he then put up the money for what became known as the Columbus Centre at the University of Sussex, which was founded in 1966 which was headed by Norman Cohn, the medievalist who wrote Europe's Inner Demons and Warrant for Genocide and so on. And the idea was to bring this group of people together, a group of people that combined historians and psychoanalysts, as well as some sociologists and others, to do what we would now, I suppose, call comparative genocide studies, but to show how the great kind of unconscious human passions move people to commit atrocities throughout history. And in 1966, it's extraordinarily ahead of its time. And Asta, I think, quite explicitly says, who was very close to Orwell, also, I think, explicitly says it's because of Orwell that I think like this. And so you can see that kind of follow through of Orwell's own refusal to say this is psychoanalytic in content, but actually thinking in a way that is leading in a psychoanalytical direction for understanding history.
Last couple of questions.
Can I dispense with the microphone? If that's okay. Can everybody hear me? Oh, it's for the room. Okay. Well, I'm not used to holding microphones, but this is an observation rather than a question. Oh, higher? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. It's an observation, which is that having listened to what you say, I see now Orwell as quite a good example of the psychology of the closeness of the far right and the far left. That's really what I've taken away. And I wouldn't be surprised if today he might be, from my point of view, as a child of Holocaust survivors and not Holocaust survivors, as an enemy. So possibly, it's very sad to say that.
Can I ask you why?
Because, well, this is a trend that I've noticed from, say, reading Twitter responses to Roger Waters or Jeremy Corbyn or Gary Lineker. I see these themes, this visceral hatred of Jews, and also an attempt to argue from authority. So-and-so, the great good, the great representative of the left says this, and I'm reposting this. So anyway, it's a sad comment, but that's what that may be a harsh thing. But one of the questions that I had in my mind before coming here is, if Orwell were alive today, what would he make of contemporary British politics and anti-Semitism?
Well, I'm afraid all I would say is what I always say, is that all speculation is profitless. I'm afraid. I mean, it's like the people who say if Dickens were alive today, he'd be writing scripts for EastEnders. He was a 19th century novelist. Orwell died in 1950. We cannot extrapolate.
Well, that's true. Say Dickens, when asked about Fagin and as a representative of an anti-Semitic stereotype, acknowledged that it was, and then subsequently wrote Little Dorrit, and that was much further away than George Orwell. So I'm not attacking Orwell. I love his writing, but I just see a dark psychology, and increasingly, as I get older, I see the centrality of anti-Semitism in both the totalitarian left and the totalitarian right.
Thank you. I mean, it's a very honest observation. And I think in response, I would say, I think what's interesting about Orwell is that he is being honest as well, and saying that he wants to understand this hatred because he feels it in himself. And that is a much braver and more honest response than that provided by most people in the face of racial hatred of any variety, which also always rests on these kind of fantasies of projection and so on. I mean, David is obviously right. We can't know what he would think. But Orwell positioned himself as a social democrat always, and I think the trajectory that we've tried to trace in terms of his own grappling with anti-Semitism suggests to me that the opposite conclusion to the one that you've drawn, I have to say. And I think.
Well, I hope so, because I admire George Orwell, and he was always a hero of mine. But just living in the world that I do, I'm impressed by what I see. see, hear, and read.
Yeah.
And it reinforces
Well,
the
that's
depth
true.
of those.
That's true.
Yeah, but the depth of the archetype. And you know, you wonder where people get these opinions from. But it's.
I think we need just one more question, because everybody needs it.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I just wanted to come back to what you were saying about how come Orwell ignored the Holocaust, and I wondered whether you thought that fitted with another trend that the historian Tony Kushner has written about, in how the trends, you know, right after World War II was you universalized the Holocaust. You didn't single out Jewish suffering, you know, itself a form of anti-Semitism. And then just very quickly, the point you're making earlier about Orwell being anti-Zionist. Obviously, you're not necessarily anti-Semite if you're anti-Zionist, but I think it's very interesting that Victor Klemperer, you know, the German academic writing his extraordinary diaries at the same time, was saying exactly the same thing, was comparing, he said, I think, the Jews who leave Germany to go to Palestine are basically just changing one form of nationalism for another. So.
Klemperer says worse than that. I set this passage to my students to confuse them, because he actually says that the that Zionism is basically a Jewish form of Nazism, but you have to understand that Klemperer is an assimilated, to use that horrible term, German Jewish professor of linguistics, deeply. To talk about being deeply immersed in German culture is nonsense. I mean, he is German, who happens to be Jewish, right, and living in Dresden, and who then, when living in a mixed marriage, you know, his wife means he's protected from deportation until right at the end, and you know the story. But here, it's a different context from Orwell, right? And when Orwell says the same thing, Klemperer says it because he's committed to a notion of Jews being German. Orwell says it in the context of a response to the British Empire and the understanding of Jews as white, and therefore being in the position of privilege. Completely misunderstanding, I think, what's the actual position of Jews in European history. With respect to Tony Kushner's point, I think, again, Orwell, I don't think it quite applies to Orwell, because he talks about other groups of people. He's on the empire. He's merciless in condemning the British attitude to imperial rule. He doesn't think in universal terms. I think in Tony's idea is about liberalism and the kind of contract between Jews and the British state. You know, you will allow you to live here as long as you don't openly show that you're Jewish, right? And Orwell has friends who are Jamaican, Indian, etc., etc. I don't think he thinks in those terms. So there's also something slightly off there that isn't quite captured by Tony Kushner's concept either.
I'm just going to finish tonight. I'd really like to, sorry, it's very hot. Thank you, the audience, for a really tremendous set of really interesting questions. And I'd very much like to thank, you know, Dan and David for sort of an incredibly, I hate the word incredibly, but I just use it, but a very, very illuminating and sophisticated and deeply thought discussion, which seems to me that's all you can do, is try really hard to think through really difficult things as honestly as you can. And sadly, I can't commandeer you to buy their books because the bookseller is ill, but I do recommend both of these books as being really extraordinary testaments actually to a tradition, two different traditions slightly, of writing that in a way comes also from Orwell's clarity, actually, and honesty and self-examination. So, and thank you very much, and thank them.